Massimo Marinelli. Welcome to the Sport Businessman Podcast. It is an honor to be hosting you as you are the founder of Berkida Ventures, operating partner at Corum Capital, former board member at Leeds United, and also senior advisor to the 49ers Enterprises. Welcome again to the podcast.
Thank you, Edo. It's a pleasure to be here. And, of course, as also, part of the Berkida Ventures family, it is my honor really to be speaking with you.
And this is a conversation before Berkida Ventures starts its own podcast to become an advocacy leader in the investment space in sports media and entertainment. So we're excited to launch this conversation today.
Thank you.
So, in your experience, can you tell us from the private capital that has been flowing into the assets of sports, media, and entertainment for the past 10 years, but most importantly, the focus has grown into the space in the past 5 years with the growth of new venture and investment arms focused in the space. What is professionalization mean in the context of sports clubs or league? And does it also include governance, analytics, and operational rigor? What is the definition of professionalization?
Yeah, look, I think, first of all, as you rightly indicated, there has been so much influx of private capital into sports, right? And, it's not it's something that I think is definitely accelerating, but it's something that's been going on for a while. And if you roll back, of course, the private equity world, I look at mostly leagues, let's say 15, 20 years ago, whether it was MotoGP, whether it was Formula One. But now there is more and more money going into every level of the cap structure of a sports entity. And also, it can be sports tech, so it could be venture money, it could be growth equity money, it could be, pure private capital money. And, perhaps things that people did not expect a few years ago is also we're seeing, private equity, money into football clubs, right? Which are by definition not necessarily, known as the most cash generative businesses. But I think the key, you're still looking at businesses that can generate billion of revenues, but with a very low number of employees, right? So if you compare, let's say a run rate, just to remain on topic, football club, I think it's unlikely that you find many football clubs that will have, more than 500 people as full-time employee. Of course, there would be, in fact, oftentimes significantly less. I mean, there would be many more people involved on match day, but in terms of, how many people are involved on a regular basis, they typically tend to be, a small amount of people, but they can still generate, hundreds of millions of revenues. And I think that is why, we talk about professionalization. They're not entities that maybe necessarily have got a significant amount of resources in terms of people. And therefore, oftentimes you find that there hasn't been an awful lot of new people and therefore new competencies coming into play. And I think that is an opportunity and probably is one of the opportunities a lot of the private capital looking into sports sees and why they decide to come into it.
So 1 year ago, there was the announcement of Ineos, owner of Manchester United, who announced that they were cutting costs and they were also reducing their employees and staff workforce that was in the office. And an example that they were looking at was Man City through City Football Group that has one of the least amount of workers. Is that a prime example of professionalization of where to start professionalizing a sports club? And what can new investors into sports clubs learn from these models? And what models have you seen yourself that have worked? And
Yeah, look, I think my strong belief is that not one size fits all. You always have to look at the specific factors of each individual asset. But generally speaking, I would also say yes, you can come at it with the outside eye of an investor in chemicals or industries or whatever other businesses and try to adopt those, uh, the way of working in those sectors across sports. But you still need to keep in mind that sports is a different industry. It has a different level of expectations. It is a lot more tied to human perception, and therefore you need to keep that in mind that you cannot just adopt what might work into an industrial scenario into a football club and assume it's going to be exactly the same. I think generally, when I look at the football world, with exception of the top pyramid, it's not necessarily an industry that is super well paid. And therefore, you need to keep that in mind as well, that sometimes, when you might cut simple things, like, cutting a lunch allocation or lunch, I think, that was one of the things that during the my new scenario was mentioned, right? That there was going to be no more, free canteen or whatever. But those sort of things actually really impact morale. So I'm not so familiar, to be fair, with what happened at Man United. I have to say, and obviously, I think they have a lot of capabilities. I'm sure eventually will come to good fruition, and I hope so for them. But you always need to look at a case by case basis and keep in mind that. The professionalization we're talking about here is across the board, right? I mean, as going back to what I was saying, I think somebody mentioned a few years ago that the average tenure of a Premier League club on the business side of the sporting, not including the sporting side, but the average tenure of an employee of a Premier League team is like 14 years. That doesn't signal that there is an awful lot of change, right? And when there isn't change, and we're all averse to change, right? I mean, we don't like to change. We like to go to the same coffee shop. We like to drive the same car. We like to go to the same holiday place, right? So nobody likes change. But when you don't see enough change in an organization, that's where I think there is an avenue for new opportunities. That's where you can try and shake up a little bit things by doing, trying different alternatives, different routes, making sure that people don't just sit on their laurels, which is, to be fair, in my experience, what a bit too often happens in professional sports teams, at least in Europe.
And what about when you started your career as an investment banker in media and entertainment, apart from sports clubs, of course, in the late 90s and early 2000s? What were investors mainly acquiring in this sector? What did the transactions look like? And also, what have you found today in this evolving landscape? To learn what are the most cash generative assets and business models in sports media and entertainment.
Look, at the time, my first, as you mentioned, I used to be a banker in the media sector, and sports was, let's say, included into the media sector. And at the time, the transactions around sports included more TV rights, whether it was Sky or, maybe other pay TV company in the rest of Europe, Sky Deutschland, for example, or Premiere, at the time that were part of it. So it was either TV rights, agencies that perhaps at the time were a lot more relevant as part of the ecosystem, and also as I mentioned before, leagues. Dorna MotoGP was definitely one that had a lot of private equity interest, and after Formula One. I'd say now things have changed, right? I mean, I think it's, first of all, there is a lot of capital going into startups too. There is individual teams that I think people would not expect it to happen for, let's say, private equity money. But I also think it depends that what sort of returns you're looking at and what sort of risk profile you're ready to take. I often say, and obviously, this is a little bit tied with also my activity, with Quorum Capital. But the point is, if you're looking for very high return on the equity side, you need to probably take a longer term view in sports that you might need to take onto a more traditional private equity sector where, perhaps the kind of 5 year time horizon is really the latest you would push things for, or at least, from what I know, let's say, of the space. While in sports, on an equity basis, you need to keep in mind that it's not necessarily easy to, generate cash during your ownership. and therefore, you're really, waiting for the exit to make your return. However, there are also other ways to participate into the growth of the sports investment route by perhaps looking at lending, borrowing. And I think, that is, besides being obviously by definition less risky, is also a way that you can generate cash on a more regular basis. And that's why I think, it's a good way to think about how you can invest into this industry.
So what makes lending and debt financing an attractive alternative to equity in the space specifically?
Look, I mean, I think, as I said, the risk profile is definitely, more attractive, meaning, is by definition lending less risky or should be less risky. I think because there is a need to free up cash flow, demand is relatively high from the ecosystem to be able to find ways to accelerate cash generation. And obviously that's where lenders, banks, private credit funds come into play. And I think generally speaking, when you look at the success factors of this lending, I mean, people, I think, even funds understand that sometimes you need to borrow money, and there is no pushback, let's say, in terms of making sure that that money is then repaid, because nobody wants to have a loan forever and ever. And so I think it's also an easier way to generate cash on a more regular basis. While if you're an equity owner, oftentimes we see it, right? I mean, people go and scout how much this guy got and paid, whether there are dividends paid, whether there are management fee paid. So there is always an awful lot of scrutiny over how much cash is extracted from a club versus reinvesting into the space. But if you're looking at professional sports team, you know, you need to keep in mind, notwithstanding the fact that people on the professional sports space are very much pro competition, pro making sure that, the best team wins, we are still talking about professional, right? Professional sports means that there needs to be a return generated, right?
And we've seen it recently with 1 month ago, Bloomberg releasing articles on private credit capital being focused on European transfer fees, European transfer fees, and also between the live event sector between Sports Illustrated and Tottenham for their ticketing, as well as Fasanara Capital in infrastructure for stadiums in Germany. And what are the different and other ways that maybe we don't read in the newspapers where private credit can be applied if an investor who wants to who wants to enter investing in sports through this through this method, what's another way that they can invest?
Look, you also have acquisition facilities. So when a new investor comes in and decides to buy a new sports property, might not be fully equity finance acquisition. So they might be able to find a debt partner that will provide some of the funding, but by way of debt rather than equity. I think eventually there should be more appetite also from perhaps banks to do working capital. At the moment, it's still a little bit low. And sometimes, I say to people I talk to, the chief financial officer of football clubs I talk to, for example, that maybe you need to kind of create your own synthetic revolving cash flow facility by just always having a proper array of receivables available that you can factor. And perhaps that's even sometimes even better in terms of cost of capital. Um, Perhaps more and more there would be opportunities to invest into funds of funds in private credit, right? Because that's maybe looking at the bigger investor that not necessarily want to bet into one specific asset, but in essence looking at ways that are very diversified to invest into the space. It could be people that put together a number of transfer receivables so that your risk is not specific to one club, or maybe people that put together different type of facilities. And
Wonderful.
I think could be even more innovation coming through, right? I mean, people I know have been thinking about, could you even borrow vis-a-vis, contingent transfer receivables? Could you borrow vis-a-vis, future earnings? That's something that we're seeing, particularly in the US with the NIL space exploding. People are thinking, could I go and, effectively provide a facility vis-a-vis future earnings of a star as professional sportsmen, women. So, there could be a lot of other ways to participate into the growth, as I said, that could be less risky, by definition.
And you're also senior advisor for the 49ers Enterprises, which is a prime example of an investor arm of a professional sports team, and which is corporate venture capital. Now, Italian sports, especially European sports, has always been known for not having a lot of cash available to also create these investment arms. But we recently saw 2 weeks ago the launch of the investment arm of Como. And
Mhm.
how what is what from your expertise, what is the reason behind the launch of such an investment arm for an Italian club, and how can other is there the opportunity for other clubs to replicate that around Europe, and also of course because Arsenal also has it, but clubs in Italy to
Yeah,
replicate?
I don't know the specifics of the Como Venture Capital Fund or investment arms that they launched, but I can talk out of my experience. When I was running Ace Ventures, and we obviously uh, controlled Leeds United. I was a board member, pretty heavily involved there. And what I can tell you is that these assets they demand a lot. They get a lot of attention. They get a lot of people contacting you. They want to get exposure, want to partner with the brand, want to find opportunities to cooperate. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to have arms where you could utilize your brand equity to get access to this information, to these not information, but to these investment opportunities. And I think, I can tell you that it's one of the things that to me really delivers returns for investors in sports, right? Because ultimately, people crave the ability to participate into live events, particularly, if it's the top live events. And even if they're not, by the way, I mean, like it could be a family occasion that, people are always looking for entertainment, right? So the point is there will always be assets, new opportunities, new investments that come to you because you own Como, because you own Arsenal, because you own Leeds, because you own, whichever other sports property. And this is not just football, I mean, depending on the, obviously on the country, on the space, could be cricket, could be rugby, could be volleyball, could be basketball, could be a lot of other sports. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to think how can you better sweat that access? And oftentimes they are startups. So, perhaps that's why I think, this sort of corporate venture capital arm makes sense. And frankly, like you mentioned 49 Enterprises, I've been working with them for a while. First, let's say, as partners when they first invest into Leeds United. After 6 months, we bought the club. And they told me how they were doing a lot of sweat equity deals, right? I mean, and that's was a real learning curve, right? I mean, to be fair, then obviously you always need to adapt to local dynamics, right? I mean, by any means, we weren't able to do nearly as many as you can do in the Silicon Valley. But we did do a few, where people come to you, they get access to the space, and in exchange, they give you, you become an investor. And I think that's a smart way to look for to generate extra return into this sports investment case.
And so uh, what are the three main assets that you believe from your 20 plus year experience in this space, and also looking ahead for the next 20 years? What do you think are going to be assets, some evergreen assets and investments that investors looking in the space today um, can look to capitalize on to create the most sustainable and profitable portfolio?
Look, I think to be fair, you just need people to be reading, the Berkida brief that you have contributed
Yeah,
put together
yeah,
in the last few
yeah,
months, right? I think, for example, one great example is real estate, the mixed use developments. I think we discussed this recently,
yeah,
you don't just look at stadium, look at whatever you can do around the stadium. So, you can definitely build ecosystems around those sort of sporting facilities that go beyond the success on the pitch. And that could be, a nice way to really de-risk the performance of a club, but also, extend your revenue base beyond the more traditional ticketing, commercial, and broadcasting or media rights. I think another one, you describe it very well as the pick and shovel, investment opportunity, right? So don't just look at the, you know, a big picture or high brand opportunity, but also the businesses that provide services to this sector because they will continue to grow. And to be fair, the master of this is probably being Bruin Sports Capital, right? Where they're investing into, can't remember the name of the company now, but I heard them talking about it a couple of times. I think it's a company invested in based in the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken, that basically prepares or produces the pitch for stadiums. By we're having more events, more and more opportunities, more and more games, more and more matches, you need to make sure that the pitch is top quality, and therefore, investing in that space makes a lot of sense. So whether it's the people that supply services for, like traveling agents, those sort of activities around making sure that the entertainment product is delivered properly, not necessarily travel agency for, people that attend, but more, making sure that everything is in place for the event to happen. And then, obviously, you know, it's there is always room for a newcomer coming in, right? And we're seeing a lot of new leagues coming in. But I think you need to think that the biggest leagues, will continue to be successful, right? Of course, things can change. When I was young, and obviously Serie A was probably the top football league in the world. Now, of course, it's not anymore. Premier League it is, by far the number one opportunity in the world. So, I don't know, maybe 50 years time, the NFL, the NBA will not be as strong, but, I think you'd be in pretty safe hands if you continue to, back these sort of large leagues, right?
great. Massimo, thank you so much for your invaluable advice and insights and experience that you share to the audience of investors and builders in the business of sports media and entertainment. And we wish you the best of luck for the growth of Berkida Ventures and the launch of your own podcast show to host the most important investors and people in sports.
Thank you, Edo. Thanks very much again for having me, and thank you for your help, contribution, and support. And I look forward to speaking soon.
Amazing.